The UK Home Secretary Theresa May has revised some elements of her controversial Snoopers Charter to address criticism by MPs and peers of the surveillance powers it allows. The bill, published today, reflects 129 recommendations made by 3 parliamentary committees who call for the bill to reflect the protection of privacy safeguards. The Home Office's proposed changes include 6 codes of practice setting out how the security services will use the powers in the bill, including access to personal communications data, a double-key ministerial warrant backed by judicial approval when UK security services ask foreign intelligence agencies to undertake work on their behalf, a pragmatic approach to encryption requiring technology companies to remove encryption they have applied themselves where it is possible for them to do so. The period for urgent warrants issued for the most intrusive surveillance without judicial approval is to be reduced from 5 to 3 days, and stronger privacy safeguards, including the need for a senior judge to approve security service access to a journalist's communications data.
Now, joining me to discuss that final story about the government's new surveillance plans is political commentator Mo Ansar. And on the line is security expert for Buckingham University, Dr. Julian Richards. Welcome to the programme. Dr. Richards, I'd like to ask you first, what are your main concerns about this bill?
Well, to be brutally honest, I don't have any major concerns. I think it's a good bill which does most of what we need to do to be able to ensure that our security agencies keep pace with technological developments and keep us safe.
And Mo, have you got concerns about this bill?
I think I've got great concerns. I'm not the only person who's spoken about those concerns. Every border you cross, every purchase you make, every call you dial, every cell phone tower you pass, friend you keep, article you write, site you visit is in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited but whose safeguards are not. Those are the words of Edward Snowden.
But surely, if you're on the right side of the law, you've got nothing to worry about here.
Yeah, I think all kinds of tyrannical and authoritarian governments and powers make a similar sort of claim. But let's be absolutely clear. This is horrid and it is draconian. There will be people who make the argument that this is a big government versus small government issue. The political right will often talk about rolling back the state, and this government will often make that case and will often make those claims that they are rolling back the state and asking private enterprises and private citizens to do more. But this shows exactly that we've seen with the draft legislation that's been pushed back by 3 parliamentary committees. We've had comedians like Frankie Boyle. We've had cross-party support.
Mo, sorry to interrupt. Can I ask Julian, can you come in and respond to that? Do you think if you've got nothing to worry about if you're on the right side of the law?
Broadly, yes. I mean, there are a huge number of safeguards. Actually, there are greatly increased safeguards in this bill than applied previously. Things like the double lock system for warrants, where it's not just ministerial approval but judicial approval that has to be put in place. At first glance, they've actually increased the oversight and accountability procedures here over and above what was the case before. So the picture painted by Mo there is not one that I quite recognise.
But aren't you worried about the growing surveillance industry in this country, which has taken on a whole life of its own, it seems, particularly since 9/11?
I don't think there's a growing surveillance industry in this country. I think the government has to be able to keep pace with technological changes that allow them to carry out the sorts of investigations that we pay our taxes for them to carry out. I want to be protected from terrorism and organised crime and all sorts of things, and I expect the government to be able to do that in a way that keeps pace with technological changes.
Mo, is this going to protect you from terrorism?
Absolutely not. This is Project Fear, and you may not recognise these issues, I think is the phrase that was being told, but let's explode this and talk about some absolute truths. This investigatory powers bill, the Snoopers Charter, on mass surveillance, number one, it treats us all like criminals. Number two, it doesn't help us catch terrorists. It does away with fundamental rights. And let's not forget, the government does not have an inalienable right to snoop and to know what we are doing at all times. It is going to be used to control what we do, and it threatens free speech online. Now, although the government is giving away certain safeguards and saying, well, we'll tighten up on certain areas, the language is still intentionally vague, it's still confusing, and we know that the habit of this government, especially on counter-terrorism, is to rush through legislation that nobody has any time to scrutineer. But the truth is this, the government's been doing this with Project Tempora, which is not some mystical, mythological beast. This is something that Snowden and Glenn Greenwald spoke about. The government has been using organisations like Vodafone to already do mass surveillance.
Can I turn to Dr. Richards now? Dr. Richards, can I just ask you this? Would these powers have stopped something like the attacks we saw in Paris, both on Charlie Hebdo and the gun attacks, bomb attacks more recently?
That's an impossible question to answer, actually, and we certainly can't expect any guarantees. There is no guaranteed system that would ensure we stopped all of those attacks. And this new system, even though it changes and enhances some powers, certainly doesn't give us blanket security by any means. So no, I don't think we can expect this to make us 100% safe from terrorist attacks. But
and are you worried about this product Tempora that Mo has talked about?
Well, Tempora is something that Edward Snowden brought to light. And in fact, this whole debate which led to this new bill being put in place was initiated by some of the details and the facts that Edward Snowden highlighted. And in a way, he's the one good service he's done is to get a dialogue going and to get the result of that here is to get our legislation updated and improved, in my view.
And Mo, is this going to protect us, this legislation, from Project Tempora?
I don't think so at all. I think what Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras did was very and vitally important. I think history will show that it was probably more important than some of the disclosures of papers that we saw during certain American presidents, which brought down presidencies. The reality is this, that the world, and in particular the US, are outsourcing their mass surveillance to the UK. In the US, they can only get metadata. In the UK, for the longest time that we know, GCHQ have been intercepting through your fiber optic cables and your buffering when your little thing is spinning around when you're trying to watch online channels. They can 100% data gather in the UK, and they've been doing this for ages. So really, the government's been caught with their pants down. They've been caught with their fingers in the till, and they've been forced to do this. So now this bill is going to be the first comprehensive legal framework for state surveillance powers anywhere in the world. And the reason for that is because of the disclosures. And let's be absolutely clear, this is about curbing civil liberties. This is not about terrorism. This is not about clamping down on criminality. And if you've got nothing to hide, you won't worry about this stuff is a complete nonsense.
Removal of encryption. There's an ongoing Apple case. How likely will the tech companies comply with this legislation? Well,
in a way, that's unknown at this stage. And a lot of these cases, the Apple case being one in particular, will be very, very interesting test cases where we can see whether and how much they will comply. You'll notice in the new bill, companies can be asked to remove encryption where it's practicable for them to do so. And that leaves a very big sort of grey area that both the government and the tech companies will argue in both directions as to what's practicable and what isn't. And I think we're just going to have some test cases to see how this pans out.
Mo, are you worried about the removal of encryption?
Well, I think encryption is important. I think people have a fundamental right to privacy, and these are issues around liberty. I think the bigger questions that we need to ask are, what is the role of the state? And what are the rights and responsibilities of the state? And what are the duties owed to a state to its citizens? If citizens have a right to a private life, then any pictures anybody may upload, any conversations you have, any Skype conversations you have, to know that all of this is 100% mass surveillance, data surveilled and gathered, is worrying. The Apple case shows one thing very clearly, which is government now believes it has a basic fundamental right to ask private companies who have end-to-end encryption like Apple, and presumably that will also mean people like WhatsApp and other organizations and companies that have online applications for people to transfer data which government cannot currently get its teeth into. The Apple test case is going to be absolutely vital. It's not just about Apple's encryption. It's not just about terror attacks in the US. If Apple falls, so will all the rest of the dominoes.
Thank you. Dr. Richards, I mean, we've seen governments in the West, America and Britain in particular, committed to, as Mo mentioned, to reducing big government, and cutting back on state expenditure. But there's been a massive expansion of state expenditure around this sort of technology, this surveillance system. Isn't this a bit ironical?
Well, there's a couple of things to say. Firstly, Mo is fundamentally wrong that this gives the government mass surveillance powers. It doesn't. It allows them to gather a lot of information which they can then use in properly targeted and authorised operations. This is not mass surveillance. But in answer to your question, this doesn't actually massively increase the cost. This is actually extraordinarily low cost to do these sorts of things compared to many other areas of government and public expenditure. The sort of Orwellian picture that's being painted of a tyrannical government out of control is frankly ridiculous. This is about delivering security. We have a right to security in this country, and the government is attempting to do that in the most effective way possible.
Mo, Dr. Richards says you're fundamentally wrong, and this is about security and needs protection. How do you respond?
I think Dr. Richards needs to take a long, hard look in the mirror and talk to some people who know about this stuff. And the reason I say that, with all due respect, is that estimates are we're already spending in the billions of pounds a year on the mass or the industrial government complex around mass surveillance. To say mass surveillance isn't happening, there is credible, authenticated evidence that shows this is already happening. The reason for this bill is that this stuff is already happening. The government's been caught with their pants down, and now they need to bring in a bill to cover everything they've been doing in secret already. GCHQ has been, for the longest period, already intercepting your emails, not just metadata, not just who you emailed, when and what time, what you say in your emails. This is the reason that the US have constitutional protections and can only have metadata, but that's why they outsource their mass surveillance to us. We do the mass surveillance for them. Organizations like Vodafone and others are already doing the 100% data gathering. This isn't something new that's coming. This has already been going on, and this is after the fact. So I'm afraid your other guest really needs to
let's just ask Dr. Richards this. We wouldn't have known about much of this if it hadn't been for Edward Snowden. This was secret. I mean, even GCHQ for a long time was secret. We can't rely on the state to protect our civil liberties sometimes, it seems.
Well, it is true, as I said earlier, that one of the things Edward Snowden achieved was to bring this whole debate out into the open. And one of the outcomes of that is that we now have a much clearer and a more clearly defined legislation in place. So that's a good thing. You know, that generally, secrecy has changed from the Cold War days when the likes of GCHQ were first formed to a much more open and accountable and clearly defined set of legislation and powers. So, you know, this is going in the opposite direction from the picture that's being painted by the other speaker here. Things are much clearer, much more accountable. There are much more stricter controls in place here than there were previously. So surely that has to be a good thing.
Are you happy, Mo, with those much stricter controls Dr. Richards talks about?
No, I think the government's done what you would expect it to do. It's produced a draft legislation which was absolutely ridiculous, which was so thick, treacle-like, unable to be deciphered by anybody reasonable. We had legislators and people from the Bar Society to cross-party parliamentarians all saying the same thing. This is impossible to navigate. And so what the government's decided to do then is concede certain areas and say on these certain aspects we are going to be tightening up. But this is no win for civil libertarians. This is no win for civil rights.
Mo, thank you very much, Mo. Thank you both, gentlemen, for that.